Welcome, everyone, to today's episode. I am Rust Felix, co founder and CEO of Slope. And today we are here to talk about a timely and pressing topic: the recent update to the ICH E6R3 GCP guidelines and what it means for biospecimen data. As of July 23rd, 2025, the EMA will begin enforcing these new guidelines. And for sponsors managing biospecimens in clinical trials, this marks a pivotal shift in expectations, especially when it comes to data governance. Join me today is someone I'm thrilled to have on the podcast, Edie Edens, a seasoned legal and regulatory expert in the life sciences from the Kulkarni law firm. Edie, thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, always a pleasure, Russ. Absolutely love coming on and talking about this today. I'm sure that says a lot about me as a regulatory nerd, but it's such an important conversation, and it's one that is not the easiest to have, right? Sponsors are aware this is coming. That's one part of the puzzle. But actually operationalizing this, knowing that July 23rd is now days away when you're in the EMA, that's a whole nother issue altogether. And I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yeah, this has been a really galvanizing topic of conversation as I've kind of traveled across Europe this spring, in large part because the latest GCP updates put a spotlight directly on data governance, and biospecimens are in that spotlight, whether sponsors realize it or not. So,
Mhm.
Edie, kind of digging into the new data governance section of R3, why is it such a significant change from previous versions?
Yeah, and this has been a hot topic because I think, you have some folks saying it's a big change, some saying significant, but the notable shift here for me as a regulatory expert is you've got an entire section. All of 4.3 is dedicated to data governance now. Now that doesn't mean that it wasn't a suggested topic, that we didn't cover, bits and pieces of it, excuse me, in prior iterations. But we didn't have an entire section dedicated to nothing but this. And it wasn't emphasized to the same extent before. Because now what we're really seeing, the upgrade or where the bar is being raised, is that it's not just about having systems in place. That was step one, right? Now it's really about ensuring, are those systems validated? Are the audit trails that are going to come with them complete? Are we going to know that access to that data is governed, right, and controlled? And especially from a compliance and auditing perspective, is retrieval easy and traceable, right? That's a huge component that a lot of folks really don't understand the importance of, and I know we'll get into. But again, this was a more suggestive state previously, as opposed to now, this is just being very clearly enumerated and required. And the application is being very clearly detailed here and delineated. It applies to any computerized system used in a clinical trial, full stop, including those that manage biospecimens. So, like you said, now we really have to completely wrap our arms around the fact that biospecimens are in this spotlight.
So, for listeners, this means that if you're using tech to manage your biospecimen collection, tracking, or reconciliation, it needs to meet these new data governance requirements, right, Edie?
Yes, absolutely. Spot on. The guideline is really, really clear here. Again, like we're saying, being very well enumerated. There's a quote actually in section 4.3.4G. Can you tell I'm a lawyer? But it says, and it's really important. It's why I've got it pulled up here. The responsible party should ensure that the computerized systems are validated as fit for purpose for use in the trial, right? So we're talking about a responsible party, and we're talking about a computerized system. We see validated in there, and we see fit for purpose. These are all really key terms. And that what it essentially says in non-legal speak, right, is this includes the systems developed or managed by third parties, which we know is a huge component of our logistical workflow in trials. So sponsors are still going to be responsible and on the hook, even when they're using, and understandably so, third party vendors and outsourcing. This really changes that responsibility matrix.
And this is a really big theme in R3 and a massive difference that I know that sponsors are coping with in regards to oversight. So, one thing that I've seen that happens a lot in discussions is that biospecimen data often gets overlooked. Sponsors don't hesitate to use an EDC system on their trials or to prioritize things like safety data compliance. But when it comes to biospecimens, which with R3 are now data, we still see paper, manual logs, Excel trackers, email threads, and disparate systems. These introduce all kinds of issues, including audit trail gaps, validation problems, and major access risk controls.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And here, this is where the part that I feel like is most frustrating is you could have a really fantastic clinical trial team managing your samples exceptionally well, doing everything, perfectly. But if the system that they're utilizing itself doesn't meet the standards, then they're non-compliant, even though that wasn't their intention. Right. And this is where this becomes exceedingly important to understand. I think another common misconception here is that sponsors think, well, our lab has an LIMS, a LIMS, right? Learning Information Management System. And so we're going to be covered here. But again, you have to dive into the change here in R3 that is that actually purpose built for this? Is it validated for this? Is it end-to-end compliance with R3? And so here we want to make sure that we understand, an EREC solution could get you compliant in a few places, but that's not end to end. That's not soup to nuts, right? And some of the things that you were alluding to, like the paper manual logs or using Excel spreadsheets to track, having, 14 emails cobbled together as a thread. I mean, that's really just stitching together a disparate solution. And it's very likely that not only will you miss pieces, but it's not going to be easily retrievable. It's not fit for purpose. It doesn't meet the standard when it comes to, what the expectations now are for data governance.
So, what you're saying, Edie, going back to your example of the perfect team doing perfect sample collection, which I know is the goal, but we don't always achieve that goal. You could have the perfect system in place. You could have EDC, you could have LIMS, but what I'm hearing you say is that R3 doesn't care how careful your team is if your system can't prove it. And this is where traceability comes into place, right?
Yep. And that's exactly it. And I'll tell you, as someone who goes in and audits and does compliance, like this is not a fun position to be in. When we can see that a team has tried really hard and had best intentions and this was not a bad actor, right? It's very unfortunate, but you are in a position that now the regulation says this is the standard, which means I still have to find your team non-compliant and your process non-compliant, even despite all those best efforts, right? And your great team.
So let's shift a little bit and talk about what we've been seeing in the industry with regards to R3. So we at Slope have actually been collecting data over the last few months through a self-assessment that we launched on our website to help sponsors evaluate their risk under R3. The results have been really, really interesting. We've had a number of sponsors complete it, and I just kind of wanted to share with you and our listeners the trends that we're seeing. So let's start with audit trail completeness. Nearly all of the sponsors who completed the self assessment can't retrieve a sample's full history without digging through multiple reports and data sources or calling and emailing sites and labs. Even then, there are gaps in things like this,
Hmm.
especially around collection at the site and lab to lab transfers. Those are black boxes. And then in regards to data access and security, the vast majority of the sponsors who took our self assessment still use spreadsheets. And Edie, you and I have talked about spreadsheets before with no
Hmm.
formal access to governance process. That is a clear red flag under R3. And then lastly, we spoke a little bit about system validation, but our self assessment findings also demonstrated that there is a widespread misunderstanding that systems can be validated out of the box. This is not true. In reality, sponsors often lack documented user acceptance training or fit for purpose validation models. What do you think, Edie, about these
Oh, this
results?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to cut you off there. This absolutely tracks with what I've been seeing. I mean, first and foremost, when you're talking about the audit trail completeness, I mean, this is where, again, coming in as an auditor or the expectation of an auditor from an agency, easily retrievable means that your team should not, by any stretch, be having to call and email and cobble together a trail to show how this biospecimen or how this data was collected and rightfully stored and utilized in the trial. And easily retrievable, I mean, don't get me wrong, an auditor isn't expecting you to know it off the top of your head, or be able to print it out, in 10 seconds. But if it takes, longer than an hour for you to go back to the appropriate systems and get me that audit trail, we're starting very quickly to get out of easily retrievable land. And again, even once you pull it, is it complete? Does it have every step? Is it going to paint the picture? Because you have to understand that audit trail has to be completely explainable to someone who is not on your team and who was not a part of that trail, like, right? And that's how clear it has to be. Further, when you're talking about data access security, like you said, I mean, we've talked about this before. Spreadsheets do not have the ability to be validated to these standards, nor do you have that governance access process for control. And so this methodology that's been used, for a long time, and it's kind of slid by the regulators and biospecimens, is simply not going to be it's not going to meet muster any further, right? Because of that. And finally, it's the validation. Not only is it the out of the box issue, but it's also the fit for purpose. Just because you can, one, actually make the purchase of the software, that's not validation. Then once you bring it out and have it user acceptance trained or tested, that is your second step toward having it officially validated. But was it really fit for purpose for what you're doing with it? So those three pieces, these are really fixable problems, but you've got to take it seriously. And sponsors, I really want to make sure realize that again, biospecimens are now falling squarely under data governance. There's not a carve out, they're not in a different bucket. So this all applies to you in those types of trials.
And again, that's because under R3, biospecimens are now data. And when I think back to the SCDM conference that I went to in Brussels earlier this year, they talked a lot about this switch. Regulators also talked about that sponsors should be on notice that this is a regulatory expectation that they need to meet. The draft guidance has been out there for quite some time. And so what this does is it leaves sponsors asking a really important question. And this is something that our listeners are probably hoping that you can help answer. What should sponsors be doing right now to prepare?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're seeing a lot of this at KLF, in clients that are coming to us with exactly those questions. And here's what we tell you. The first thing you can do is start by mapping your current biospecimen operations to these new requirements. Okay. And when we think about what that means, so if you are an organization that's still using spreadsheets or paper logs, understanding that's going to have to change, understanding that leaves you exposed, and instead making sure you have a more robust solution for documenting the actual collection of the biospecimens, the end-to-end chain of custody, which is huge, as we all know, the actual acts related to accessing the biospecimens for processing, for analysis, and understanding and documenting well any type of retention or destruction. And that has to happen for every single sample that you're working with, right? So we need to make sure that we understand sort of globally here, that you've got a lot of different systems, you've got a lot of different databases. Staff could be burdened with having to log biospecimen data and chain of custody into all separate, or different types of tracking mechanisms. So if you can make sure here that you have something that is again end to end for that documentation, chain of custody, process analysis, and then retention or destruction, you're going to have a much better shot at compliance, you're also going to have probably a much better relationship with your site because that's going to enable and empower them to do more faster. And then you're also, once you figure out what your new process is going to be, you need to make sure you've got the documentation about the procedures of what is this new process. So sometimes we're really good in the trenches about actually creating a new process that, again, is trying to meet the compliance requirements. But if you don't document it so that an auditor like me could come in and say, let me see how your process works. Show me the documentation. Show me how you train. Show me how it's systemized and clearly delineated to your team. Then we dig into, is the system actually working? And that is then when you're going to get to that next step, which is your system validated? So now you're going to have auditors looking and checking on that. So you're going to want to ensure not only that you've done all the appropriate steps to have a validated system, but again, do you have the documentation that you've done the right user acceptance training and that it's fit for purpose? And finally, while I'm handing out to-dos, as we said earlier, and I don't want to, it's not that I'm trying to quote unquote beat the dead horse, right? As they say, rather, again, as an auditor and having been on the receiving end of so many audits for my clients, this one is just a huge piece of it. Please, 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 whatever you're setting up, however you're documenting it, always keep your eye on the fact that your data's got to be easily retrievable, traceable, and protected from unauthorized access. Even if the unauthorized access doesn't do any harm to the data, the point is in privacy, if you weren't authorized to have access, you should not have a mechanism of access. And like we said earlier, easily retrievable runs out very quickly when an auditor is standing in front of you requesting the chain of custody. And it's taking you 14 phone calls and 13 different logins, right? And you're having to chase down coordinators who didn't work at your organization, for the last year. Like that's when you're definitely out of compliance at that point.
That's when you feel that sinking feeling in your
Oh,
stomach,
it's the
right?
worst. It's the worst. You never
So,
want to have that.
Edie, thank you for sharing that smorgasbord of tips. They were incredibly helpful, but I think it is important to note one thing here. This isn't just one team's responsibility. You need cross-functional collaboration to be compliant between data management, biospecimen ops, clinical ops, translational medicine, IT, and quality teams. And so at Slope, we've built our technology and our platform specifically to address these challenges, providing end-to-end visibility, complete traceable audit trails, access control, and validation protocols so that sponsors aren't left exposed. We've had a great conversation today and have covered, I think, a lot of really, really helpful topics. But if you're not sure where you stand on ICH E6R3, the new guidelines going into effect as we speak, I encourage you to visit slopeclinical.com and take our free self-assessment. It only takes a few minutes and it gives you a clear view of your compliance risk, including around biospecimen data governance. I'd also like to remind our listeners that EMA enforcement begins on July 23rd. If you are running a clinical trial with stakeholders in Europe, you must be R3 compliant by July, I guess, 12:01 in the morning on July 23rd. Um, sorry, Edie, go ahead.
Oh no, you just cracked me up with the 1201. Thinking like a regulator. I like it. You know, this is one of those, this is where it's sometimes hard to be in the position of being the legal and regulatory expert because you do want to light a fire under folks. I want to make sure sponsors understand, look, the guidelines are very clear here. The bar has been raised. And your time to comply is running out. You need to take this very seriously. Having said that, I don't want to scare people, right? I'm not a fear monger. I want sponsors to know and our listeners to know you still have time to course correct, right? Even if you're not on top of this or you feel like you're behind in this moment, you do have great tools like the free self assessment that you guys are offering. And the next few months are going to be very telling. Right. As we see EMA enforcement go into play, you're going to then learn what the expectations are. And as those first audits happen, we'll know more. But the reality is, other jurisdictions are going to follow quite quickly. So there's no time left. There's a very clear line in the sand here with E6R3. And that's really what we want our listeners to walk away with, right? Some helpful tools, some better understanding, but that firm knowledge that if your biospecimen data isn't governed at the same level of rigor as your clinical data, you could already be non-compliant. And you need to be aware of that and understand and explore that.
Edie, thank you so much for the discussion. I mean, given the topic, which is a little dry, I think that we've done a pretty good job of helping sponsors kind of understand what's happening, when it's happening, and why it's important. At Slope, we know regulatory guidance can be complex, and interpreting it and applying it to your biospecimen workflows is not always the most straightforward process. That's why we've partnered with leading regulatory experts like Edie to help you understand what ICH E6R3 means for your biospecimen management and how to operationalize compliance. Your first step is to assess your risk. And with this, we've created a free self-assessment tool at slopeclinical.com/ICH-E6-R3 to help you identify where you're in good shape and where you might need to take a closer look. We understand biospecimen operations often span multiple teams and stakeholders, so we've built this tool to guide you through the gray areas as well. If you're unsure how to answer something, no problem. Just flag it and we'll help you track down the information you need. And then after you submit the risk assessment, you'll receive a score indicating your risk level in 3 different areas, including data governance. Any questions you skip won't be averaged into your risk score, so be sure to book a free slope-led consultation with your colleagues so we can help you get the full picture on R3 for your organization. And if you're not ready to take the self-assessment, that's okay too. You can schedule a conversation with one of our experts to talk through where to begin and where to go. We're here to make this process feel a lot less overwhelming. So, regardless of where you'd like to start with assessing your compliance gaps, please give us a visit at slopeclinical.com and choose the path that's right for you. We're here to help you move forward with confidence. Thanks so much today.
Thank you.